I reside in Colorado. I do mostly rotating schedule work. In my HAA work is in Colorado as well. And the utility longline work is up in Alaska. So you'll see a bunch of footage from both places throughout the presentation and towards the end. I'm an active volunteer with the U.S. Helicopter Safety Team and an ambassador for Vertical Aviation International, or VAI, used to be HAI, and a safety advocate for all things helicopter. So I'm not a fixed wing pilot, and a lot of our mountain flying awareness information tonight will be targeted towards helicopter, and I'll do my best to bridge the gap as much as I can. But a good chunk of it, 90% of it, is applicable to all aircraft. So hoping that you find some value in the mountain flying awareness, and then we'll follow that up with some backcountry survival stuff. So again, primarily targeted towards helicopter ops, but I'll do my best to bridge the gap there, like I said. And with the mountain terrain and mountain flying, we're going to focus more on how to get you through the terrain or information to cross the mountain range or cross ridges and some of the things that are happening with winds and weather, and less so the landings involved in the mountain environment. So mostly getting you through the mountains and less so how to land in the mountains. And of course, this is never a replacement for any sort of actual instruction. If you are interested in flying in the mountains, or if you've done a little bit, gotten a taste maybe, and you're interested in learning more, I would strongly advise that you go out with an experienced flight instructor who knows the mountains well and can teach you with some hands-on skills. There's absolutely nothing that can replace that. So with considerations, the presentation here is going to follow these 5 targeted subjects for the mountain environment. The first is going to be aircraft performance, pressure, altitude, temperature primarily. And then we'll go into some environmental stuff, wind visibility, some unusual weather situations, and then what can happen to you as the pilot as well as your crew in terms of hypoxia concerns, spatial disorientation, some illusions that may not happen in flatland environments, and then also some navigational resources. And finally, backcountry preparation. Most of that is going to be in the second part of our time tonight. So for performance, you'll hear some helicopter terminology here. So when you hear OGE, that means out of ground effect hover. That's when a helicopter is out of its ground effect. We have ground effect just like a plane does. It's within 1 rotor disc diameter of the ground. So for most helicopters, that's 20 or 30 feet. And it's very similar to fixed wing aircraft. So when we are out of our ground effect, our performance goes up. It takes more power from the engine to hover out of our ground effect than it does in ground effect. So OGE and IGE, that's what that means, out of ground effect or in ground effect hover performance. So anytime you're landing off airport or traveling off airport, you're going to need more power from your aircraft. And so we have charts, performance charts, just like fixed wing, to determine whether or not we have the appropriate performance from our engine to go into the mountains, regardless of whether or not we're landing. So even if you're passing through the mountains, you still need to plan performance-wise to account for and handle a forced landing situation. So anytime helicopters are trying to do those calculations, we're planning to have worst case scenario. Do I need to make a forced landing in the mountains? And same thing with fixed wing aircraft. Always think worst case scenario. Second, is your aircraft up for the task? Some people think, oh, bigger is better. A twin engine helicopter is larger. It's going to be more capable. And often that's actually not the case because of all the extra weight that happens with a twin engine aircraft. And that might be the same in the fixed wing world. So just regardless of what you're flying, is your aircraft up for the task of the additional demands of the mountain environment? Not only getting through the mountain environment, but also are you equipped to handle a worst case scenario? So in the helicopter world, a lot of the mountain environment, either utility or air ambulance or fire, whatever the operation, at high altitude is often in single engine helicopters because you get a little bit more bang for your buck in terms of performance. And when you're considering performance, one way to handle that is with a performance envelope. So instead of saying, well, this is my max temperature, this is my max gross weight for the day, and I'm going to look at my one number for performance and give it a thumbs up or thumbs down, instead consider using an envelope. And here's what that looks like. So in particular, direct your attention to the right side of that chart. And that's what an envelope looks like. You have TOM, takeoff mass. And of course, you see the hovering, out of ground effect, and in ground effect. You can ignore that for the time being. It's applicable to all aircraft. Take your takeoff mass and then the range of temperatures you might experience with your change in altitude. So you see altitude there on the bottom, you see a range of temperatures, and you see a change in takeoff mass because you're going to be burning fuel. So sometimes this performance chart or envelope is an easier way to determine changing power demands as you're moving through the mountains, especially if you're on a longer flight, a longer cross-country flight that involves mountains. And it gives you a more precise minute-by-minute account for your performance rather than just a single number that's maybe the worst-case scenario or best-case scenario. So you can better track your performance throughout the entire flight. So secondly, we'll address the environmental concerns around the mountains. The awareness of your wind direction and your speed is absolutely critical. And you need to be consistently evaluating not only the small picture local winds, what's happening there in your immediate environment, but also the larger picture prevailing winds, whether that's related to a storm front or a thunderstorm nearby, or the time of day, if you have valley winds that are coming and going with the change in sun aspect. There's a lot of stuff going on there, and it's always changing. So being able to understand your area and the trends for that particular range, and then evaluating constantly throughout your flight. So as the ground comes up and creates a mountain environment, a range, whether it be a small, say a hillside, a massif that's independent, and there's mostly plains around it with kind of a mountain that's in the middle, or whether you're talking about a larger range, anytime you see that rising ground, the wind is going to come across the flatland and then hit those mountains, and the wind is also going to rise with that terrain. That's called the windward side of the terrain or of the range. And then similarly, as the ground falls away down the other side, the wind is going to naturally fall with it. The surface wind will fall with it, and that's the leeward side. So the more rugged or sharp that terrain, the more turbulent the wind is going to be. Whereas if you have, say, foothills, a rolling foothills kind of situation, you may get a little bit less turbulence than if you had this jagged mountain range that sticks out of nowhere. So those two things are going to be related. And air passing through really tight valleys or tight saddles, especially in more rugged terrain, is going to have more rapid increases in speed. And that's the simple physics, the Venturi effect. When we tighten any sort of fluid, whether it be water or air, we get an increase in speed. So this is a pictorial representation of what that really looks like. We have wind coming over plains or the ocean, and then they hit mountains and they climb with those mountains, and then drop off on the other side, on the leeward side. And that windward side is going to have less turbulence than the leeward side. So once the wind falls off that leeward side, it tends to get really rough and spindly and turbulent. And it's a much more challenging environment, much more turbulent environment for any aircraft. So the updrafts that are related to the windward side tend to be a better, more favorable flying condition. You'll get better lift, better power. Sometimes that will change a little bit with sun aspect. If you have sun splashing on the windward side, you'll get even better updrafts because you now have rising air, versus a shady side where it might be a little less extreme for those updrafts because we're not seeing the rising air from the sun. So sun aspect also plays a part here. And then the leeward slope has way more of that spinning air and turbulence as it goes over the mountains, especially with the increase in steepness or the ruggedness of the terrain. So one of the more challenging aspects is to plan for those strong downdrafts that can occur on those leeward sides and can push you down into the terrain. So helicopters tend to stick closer to terrain compared to fixed wing aircraft. And we need to be even more conscious of the potential for getting pushed around by those winds. Whereas when you're in a plane crossing mountains, assuming you have the performance, you may be able to keep a slightly higher altitude to avoid some of those bigger up and down drafts with the windward and the leeward sides. So all depending on the performance and the flight path of your particular aircraft and your mission for that day. So the space where the windward side of the winds and the leeward side come together is called the demarcation line. And the demarcation line is a really important thing to note, especially if you are flying close to the terrain. If you're a couple thousand feet above the terrain, it's not going to apply to you too much. You're going to be above it and not need to worry about this demarcation line. But if you're flying close to the terrain because of performance or by choice, like in the helicopter world, we might be landing on top of that mountain, I need to know exactly where that line is. And it's completely invisible, right? I'm only gauging that by feel. So that demarcation line is going to change with the wind velocity and the angle of the terrain. If I have really steep, sharp, shark tooth style mountains and really strong winds, that line is going to increase in steepness. If I have rolling hills and gentle winds, it will be laid down a little more horizontally, and it will impact my potential for passing through that terrain or my potential for landing. So I don't have to worry about it as much. It's not as strong. But it's something to be aware of, that demarcation line where windward and leeward come together. If you are going through a valley, so you can kind of take this picture and pretend like you're traveling through this valley, there's terrain on either side, try to find the windward side. And that calls back to what I was saying earlier about understanding the prevailing winds of that area. Where is that windward side going to be? And I might just get in there and feel it out. So if I'm traveling on one side of the valley and it's turbulent and icky and it doesn't feel very good, or I feel downdrafts, I'm probably on the leeward side. So I'll just fly over on the other side and see what it's like over there. I'm feeling out the winds and trying to better understand what's going on in the bigger wind picture, and determining my path through that valley based on the winds. And usually the windward side will require overall less power. When we're talking about crossing a ridge line or crossing a saddle, generally speaking, take that at an angle. 20 to 45 degree angle is about appropriate. It'll give you the best wind options. And if you do get into trouble or it's more turbulent than you expected, that angle will give you a broad view of now the most open part of your terrain. So if we're going through a saddle, you pick a side and you're taking that at a 20 to 45 degree angle, I have my entire view of the rest of the saddle open and plenty of space to be able to turn around, make my 180, essentially a go around. That's not going to work. It doesn't feel right. I'm just going to make my turn right now, get out of there and try something different. So that angle is a great way to approach. You have options to turn around and you have plenty of space within that saddle to make your turn. Whereas if you go 90 degrees right over the middle of the saddle, you're probably in one of the worst places to handle the winds, and you've just limited or cut in half your ability to turn around before you hit the terrain. And then maintaining some distance. So about 1,000 feet over the ridge is about right. For helicopters, we might stay a little bit lower than that. Next, weather conditions. Weather and winds can change any time in the mountains, and operations in mountain valleys in particular can lead to entrapment because you might not be able to see over into the next valley. And anytime you're going especially lower into a valley where you have terrain around you, having an option, at least one, hopefully more, to leave that valley, an option for egress, is really important. And planning for that long before you descend into that valley, whether it's to cross a low saddle or because you're trying to stay free of clouds, whatever the case, always have an option to get out of there. If you cannot fly into that valley without an option to leave, don't go in there. Weather conditions can change too quickly in the mountains where you'll potentially fly yourself into a trap. And this slide kind of encapsulates that too. These are two different photos of conditions that were just over a valley from one another. So even if you see the clear picture of the weather in one valley, you can't assume that it's going to apply to anywhere else. So be sure that you have multiple options of ways you can get from one place to another and escape that weather. Now we'll address a few crew-oriented things, whether that be you as the pilot or if you have other people on board with you. And the first one is spatial disorientation. And spatial disorientation, if any of you have experienced it, you might know how scary it can be. There have been many, many accidents related to disorientation. Of course, the top on the list is probably double IMC. So there are some spatial disorientation issues that can happen in the mountains that can catch you off guard. And being surrounded by peaks and valleys will change your perception. Usually we're used to having a horizon, and now we don't. Where the horizon would normally be now has all sorts of terrain. So it's hard to sometimes gauge where that horizon is. If you have advanced equipment in your aircraft, that can really help. Being able to focus on instruments, making sure you cage your altitude indicator before you leave the ground, so you have a reference for what actually is level, and that can help you stay oriented. But often the demands of flying in the mountains takes our eyes outside a lot. And you can, of course, keep your scan, keep your gauges, all that good stuff. However, we also have a lot of hazards outside. So our eyes need to be out a lot. And this can increase the potential for our disorientation. I'm not saying you shouldn't have your eyes outside, you totally should. However, the absence of a natural horizon can be very disorienting. In addition to that, we have turbulence, we have visibility, or some precipitation illusions if you've had rain coming down your windshield, in addition to turbulence, in addition to the absence of horizon. All those things can add up to a pretty scary situation in the mountains. Hypoxia is a big concern. And it's important to note that not all mountain flying occurs at high altitude. For example, Alaska. However, the hypoxic symptoms are cumulative. So even at lower altitudes, 4, 5, 6,000 feet, if you stay there for a long time, or you've just come from sea level and now you're doing flying at those altitudes, it can affect you and your ability to make good decisions, memory, motor skills, all those things. And some severe impairments have been shown at as low as 9,000 feet. So here in Colorado, our airport here in Alamosa is 7,200 feet. So we are only going up from there. And always have oxygen on board if your aircraft is capable of that, and plan to spend as little time as possible if you don't have oxygen available crossing the mountains. That might impact your flight planning when you go over big mountains. So eyesight, one of the biggest detractions, one of the biggest symptoms is a loss of eyesight, as well as depth perception and peripheral vision. And all that can have a negative effect on your experience of flying the mountains for you and your crew. Some other high altitude issues, dehydration is a really common one. Your body is compensating already pretty hard to deal with the lack of oxygen. So if you are additionally dehydrated, or maybe feeling low blood sugar, you haven't eaten very well, all those things can have this cumulative effect over time, as well as acute mountain sickness. And acute mountain sickness is most people experience it more as nauseous. I get a headache. That's my first trigger for any sort of high altitude thing is a headache. However, it's also my first trigger for dehydration. So be aware that some of these physiological symptoms related to altitude can mask for each other. You might be feeling dehydration. You might be feeling AMS. Not really sure. You might be feeling hypoxia. They all present pretty similarly for some people. So just something to be aware of as you're trying to understand what might be going on with you or with a crew member. So some visual illusions in the mountains. We talked about a lack of horizon. That's a big deal, or a false horizon because you're in varied terrain, different cloud layers that might be unfamiliar. It's hard to sometimes distinguish all those things. What is turning, what is not. Again, always cage your AI on the ground, and then ideally don't touch it. So sometimes the difference, if you have, say, a cloud layer or visibility is low, and you have peaks with snow on top of them, those can start to blend together and mix up a little bit. So that, again, in addition with some of the other issues like hypoxia symptoms, might cause you to experience a visual illusion or spatial disorientation. And same thing with being confined in a valley. if you're not familiar with that terrain or don't have a lot of experience flying close to terrain, your depth perception is going to be different. You don't have that capacity to judge distance like you do when you can tell what 500 feet is. You've been flying at 500 feet or 1,000 feet, you know what that looks like. But our perception of depth in the horizontal plane is often less exercised. Night flight in the mountains, often not recommended in mountainous terrain, except in the case of NVG, pilot and crew. If you have night vision goggles training, you have night vision goggles on board, flying in the mountains at night can be appropriate. Even then, the risk still goes up. So you may be passing over a mountain range at night. Again, risk goes up no matter how you slice it. There's no way to make that not risky. However, it's good to acknowledge, and your workload will certainly go up. Your fatigue levels will go up. You have a difference in depth of perception and ground reference, just like we talked about earlier, and your peripheral field vision capacity for illusions goes way up at night. So extra risk, not always a no-go, but extreme caution. Navigation. So when we're flying over land, we often have this direct line of sight navigation, can be totally appropriate. We are over flat land, we know our obstacles, we can see the obstacles, we can look on our chart and determine our minimum safe altitude. However, in the mountains, that's not going to be appropriate most of the time. So the following the pink line on your ForeFlight or your GPS, probably not so much. You need a little bit more flexibility in the mountains than you do in flatland terrain. So in general, this is a good rule. Fly as high as necessary, as low as possible. And then consider the impacts that your navigational route might have on your fuel burn, your weather considerations, and communication reception. This is more common in the helicopter world than fixed wing because we are often low and close to the terrain where you might not be able to get radio reception, line of sight without something like an RCO. And fixed wing usually flies a little bit higher. That's often not an issue, but something to consider certainly when going through rugged terrain. So this is a navigation example from Alaska. I won't spend a ton of time on this because it's very helicopter specific, but this was a ferry from north to south, pretty much across the entire state of Alaska. And the terrain you see here in the middle is the Brooks Range, for those of you who might be familiar with Alaska. And I was ferrying this aircraft. I really wanted to go more direct where the blue line is. My destination was PACS, which is Coldfoot. I needed to go there to pick up some gear. I had fuel there. I really wanted to go a little more direct through these mountains, but that required me to go over a higher elevation pass. And you see my en-route decision points, EDPs. If you're not familiar with EDPs, spend a little time researching that. It's a great tool to have in your toolbook. So I had a couple of EDPs. One was for fuel. The other one was for weather. I needed to decide if I'm going to go for the high elevation pass or the low elevation pass. I'd never been in this range before. It's an unfamiliar area. And when it was time to make that call, I ended up choosing the lower elevation pass, even though I knew I wouldn't have enough fuel to get to my actual destination, the Coldfoot area, but I would have enough, I thought, to get to this other little place where it says first fuel opportunity. It's a little town called Bettles. So I knew it was going to be tight, but I also knew that if I went over the high mountain pass, I didn't have the weather for it. So it was a conservative decision to go the low altitude pass, knowing that if I got into a sticky spot with weather, I didn't have enough fuel to be able to divert and make another decision. I wouldn't be able to go around the mountains. So that's what I decided to do. It ended up costing me about 20 miles. So in the helicopter world, 20 miles is quite a bit. In the fixed wing world, that might be insignificant, but I had fairly calm winds, thankfully, no headwind or anything. And it was about 15 gallons of fuel. So that's my VFR fuel requirement almost is 20 minutes, 30 minutes for fixed wing, 20 minutes for helicopter. So I burned through pretty close to my VFR reserve. And legally, that's fine, right? I planned for the fuel reserve. I ended up burning a little bit more. There wasn't anything illegal about that. However, it was a great lesson in, take that EDP, go the more conservative route. And that ended up costing me a little bit more in terms of mileage and fuel. So if there had been anything else in there, like a strong headwind, that would have been a pretty challenging situation. So next we'll move towards backcountry preparation and some resources that you should have when you're flying through the mountains. And we'll go into this in more detail. So this is just a really quick snapshot for backcountry prep. The indirect nature of mountain flying, remoteness, the changes in altitude. So you have a lot of changing factors going on there. And never, ever, ever pass up a fuel stop, ever. Communication can be limited. We touched on that. Satellite communication device is highly recommended. Spot, InReach, there's so many fairly inexpensive devices out there nowadays. Highly recommended that you have that on board. And then the equipment inside your aircraft makes a big difference. Do you need any sort of special equipment to land in snow, even if it's a forced landing? Is there any sort of installed equipment that might increase your drag, compromise your performance, anything like that, or interfere with a potential backcountry landing situation? Survival gear, we'll get into the details of this here in a moment. But things to consider for sure: satellite communication, first aid kit, shelter, fire starter, signaling devices, and plan for a couple of days. If say weather prevents rescue, you might be out there for a little bit. Lastly, ELT. An ELT is not required for most helicopter operations, but highly recommended. They are required more in the fixed wing world. And there's a couple different types out there. Most of them will transmit automatically. And that is by a G-force sensor in there, and it will automatically transmit your signal on emergency frequencies so that SAR teams can get those coordinates from ATC and help find you in a search and rescue situation. And of course, be sure to follow the requirements in the FARs regarding the testing and maintenance of your ELT if you have one. Hopefully you never need to use this thing, but if you do have one installed, you want it to work when the time comes. So summary of the mountain flying component of the presentation: whether it's high altitude or not, can be extremely fatiguing due to the mental and physical management of the winds, the terrain, the weather, hypoxia, all these extra situations that we may not encounter in our normal day-to-day flying. And then one of my favorite quotes of all time, of course. So we're trying to use good planning and good preparation to avoid a situation that might require your superior skill as a pilot. So that sums up our mountain flying portion. And next, we're going to move straight into our winter backcountry survival. So these are skills to help you handle a backcountry survival situation and some tips for what you might want to carry on your aircraft. However, prevention, always going to be better 100% of the time than surviving an actual accident. So pre-flight planning: can you choose flight terrain that's going to be better for a precautionary landing or an emergency landing when you're going into a remote area? Can you avoid remote regions altogether? Can you fly over roads? Might give you better access to communication or other people. And then power management and performance: can you manage a higher altitude that will give you more options when it comes to a forced landing? So in the helicopter world, I try to maintain about 1,000 feet AGL so that I have better glide ratio and better options to choose my emergency landing versus flying right above the treetops. I'm pretty screwed at that point. I don't have a lot of options. So can you fly at a higher altitude that will give you some choices about where to go if you did need to put it down in an emergency? Temperatures: is there an aversion going on? Can you set yourself up for icing, wind conditions, cloud layers? Doing a really thorough weather briefing to set yourself up for success there. We touched a little bit on fuel planning in that example. So not only for the flying, but if you can handle, performance-wise or otherwise, carrying a little bit extra, it can be really helpful in an emergency. You might be able to start a fire with that extra fuel. So it could come in handy if you were in a survival situation. And then regardless of what communication or ELT you might have on board, filing a flight plan or having a flight following program, maybe you work for a company that has a flight following program, or even a friend that's watching on FlightAware, having some sort of flight following program so that someone is watching and can respond in an emergency. So in terms of prevention, PAVE and I'm Safe checklists, of course, proper risk management and pre-flight planning, making a go, no go decision. What does that really look like? You're identifying and anticipating error chains. There's a great term that I like called a pre-mortem. So we often look at accidents after they've happened, try to figure out what went wrong, and we can prevent that from happening. Well, how about we look ahead? We do a pre-mortem on that flight. What could possibly go wrong that I can catch right now and put some things in place to prevent that accident from happening right here and now. Hazardous attitudes are a big one for sure. And then proper performance, weather, and navigation planning for your flight, whether it be mountainous or any time. These are all skills that apply to any flight. So worst case scenario, something, the brown stuff hits the spinny thing and something goes wrong, you're in a winter survival situation. For our first example here, we're going to assume a couple of things, and then we'll apply these skills to other environments. So we'll assume you're in a forested environment, there's snow on the ground, cold temperatures, your aircraft you're not going to fix it on the ground, it's more or less destroyed, and you need a couple of days. You need to be out there for a couple of days because rescue can't get to you due to weather or whatever the case. And then we'll apply these things to desert and a few other environments. So no matter what you have on board, it makes no difference if you don't know how to use it. So arm yourself with knowledge. And these 5 categories are where we're going to focus as we apply these skills to other environments: communication, water, shelter, warmth, and food. Mostly in that order. You might switch a couple of the things, but in particular, the first 2 are by far the most important. Getting communication, notifying somebody where you are and what went wrong, and then water are super important. So those can be switched a little bit depending on the environment, but those are the main 5 things that we're going to focus on. And you'll see that continuous cadence here. So communication, tracking system, inReach, Spot, spider tracks, if you might have that installed in your aircraft, a signaling device, a mirror, flares, ELT, that kind of thing. Charge cords, battery packs, etc. So you might have a device with you that's awesome. If you didn't charge it before you went out and it's at 30% when you need to use it, that's not great. So being sure that you test your device, understand its usefulness, it's working the way it's supposed to work, and it's charged. Having the cords that you need and maybe some external battery packs with you so you can continuously keep your phone or your communication device up to snuff as you're out there. And managing boredom is a big one, and that speaks more to the mental side, maintaining positive attitude, etc. But that can be a really big deal in a survival situation, and having the ability to relax on your phone, listen to some music, bring the morale up, that kind of thing. If you have a battery pack that can keep a phone going for an extra day, you'd be happy to have it. So water, bring some water with you, and a way to purify water, a way to melt water if we're talking about winter survival. Chlorine tablets, iodine tablets work really well. Water filter options, there's some great ones out there that are really simple, like a straw that you can just suck water straight from the stream, and it comes through a filter and straight into your mouth. It's pretty great. There's some wonderful, lightweight, relatively cheap water filter options out there. And then there are a lot of lightweight stoves too. There's a couple of pictures here, very simple, small, compact stoves. And then the container that comes with those stoves can double as a water storage device as well, a gathering or storage device. Nalgene bottles are awesome, and you can pack other things into Nalgene bottles when they're empty to save space in your aircraft. And then when it comes time to use it as a water collection device, you can dump all the stuff you have in there out and be able to use it as a water storage device as well. Hot water bottle for warmth is pretty awesome. You can put hot water in a Nalgene, stick it in your sleeping bag or in your jacket, and it'll keep you warm for a little bit. They stay hot for several hours. Shelter. So do you have some natural shelter available? You might have a recessed cave, a rock outcropping, something like that available. Can you build something? If we're talking about a forested environment here, you might have some tree materials available that you can build a lean-to or a teepee style shelter out of. Can you use parts of the aircraft? or the aircraft itself. And staying with the aircraft is usually the best idea. So is there a way you can incorporate the aircraft or take parts away from it and build a shelter for yourself to protect from the elements, especially the wind? And then try to insulate that shelter as much as you can with whatever you have. Trees, live trees, tree boughs, aircraft parts, maybe the seat cushions, that kind of thing, insulating yourself from the ground and or insulating your shelter from the outside environment can make a really big difference in temperature management. Warmth dressing ideally in synthetic layers. They tend to keep you warm even when they get wet. So synthetic layers are really great for that. One drawback of synthetic layers like nylon is they aren't very fire, they're not great for fire. So cotton is probably the best thing to handle a post-crash fire. However, cotton is probably the worst thing that you can possibly wear when you're talking about trying to survive in cold temperatures, especially if there's wet involved. So kind of up to you on that one. Maybe a combination is the best way to go, but good to understand your options and then be able to choose. I think I might choose the synthetic layers or a combination over just cotton. Cotton's pretty awful when it comes to warmth and especially if you have wet layers. So wood gathering tools or some sort of fire starter option could be waterproof matches, lighter. You can see a stick there, a magnesium stick where you can get sparks going for a fire. You have some sort of way to make kindling, like a multi-tool, a hatchet, a lot of different options out there for fire starting. And a synthetic sleeping bag. And I say synthetic again because of the capability to keep you warm even when it's wet versus a down sleeping bag. When down gets wet, it's fairly useless. So synthetic is a much better way to go in terms of your survivability. It packs down also quite small. So it's a good bang for your buck in terms of warmth, size, and weight. Food, MREs, pretty awesome. Those military folks in the crowd are probably familiar with these or something very similar, where they have a built-in warming system. They are a little bit heavier, but make a really great compact, especially if you choose to not carry a stove. It's a really good way to go, and they last forever. Freeze-dried food is a really great option as well, but it does need water and it needs fuel in order to use that food, whereas the MREs don't need anything external. They're pretty much ready to go right out of the bag. And plan to pack for yourself and whoever's on board with you 3,500 to 4,000 calories a day. If you are staying away from this type of meals like the MREs or the freeze-dried food, then you can consider a really dense protein bar or some other kind of snacky stuff that can pack a punch. It's dense, good, calorie-intense food. Snickers bars, protein bars, that kind of thing. Dried fruit that might not need any sort of heat or water to be useful to you. And that can be a good option as well. And a combo, maybe a combo of all these things. And then other things you might want to have on board with you, light source, some sort of headlamp, flashlight. I really like headlamps because you don't need your hands to use them. You can have it on your head and be able to direct the light and then have your hands free. Spare batteries for those things. Sometimes the batteries can wear inside, or you might, if they're packed in a bag, might hit the button accidentally and then your headlamp is out of batteries by the time you need to use it. So you can store the batteries separately, or I will keep them in the headlamp, but I'll reverse the batteries so that there's no chance that the light is gonna come on when I don't want it to, and the batteries are still gonna be fresh. So I just reverse the batteries in there, and I put a little note to myself on there because I'll definitely forget that they are reversed, and I just have to change them over and you're good to go. Spare batteries, never a bad idea. And then some kind of a first aid kit, whether it's a very simple, just talking about trauma related stuff. I would have a tourniquet in there, maybe some of those butterfly bandages for a big cut, some burn resources. So there's plenty of good to go, just simple. You can buy them straight out of the pack, ready to stick in your aircraft, or you can build your own little things here and there. And along with a first aid kit, I would really recommend a simple first aid course. Something like wilderness first aid is really great because it teaches you how to improvise tools that you might find in the backcountry in addition to whatever you're carrying in your case. So the knowledge that goes along with your tools can really take you a long way. So some sort of wilderness first aid course to go along with your first aid kit, some kind of multi-tool, absolutely. A Leatherman, Swiss Army knife, something along those lines, which often has tools you might be able to use like pliers, along with a saw, along with a knife, along with a can opener. So having tools that match your first aid, not your first aid kit, your food survival. So if you brought up some canned food, well, it's not going to do you a lot of good if you don't have a can opener. So thinking ahead about what you're going to bring, and then do I have all the equipment I need to employ the things that I bring and put them to use for me? An extra lighter would be a really good option, for example, or matches. So some adaptations for different environments. Let's say you are in an alpine environment where you don't have any trees. So your communication stuff, your water stuff is going to be exactly the same. Shelter might be a little bit different. You don't have pine boughs, you don't have trees, you don't have any sort of cave around. You might need to dig a snow cave or build some kind of an igloo wind shelter structure, and as much insulation as you can muster on the ground and above you to contain that heat. Warmth, emphasis on warm clothes, bringing extra layers, sleeping bag, that synthetic sleeping bag we talked about before, and some kind of insulation like a simple foam pad, one of those blow up foam pads. They have some really great light ones out there nowadays. They pack down to almost nothing. You can blow them up, great insulation, or just a simple foam pad. And then your food situation is going to be pretty much the same. Let's say you don't have any evergreen trees. There's no pines, but you're in a deciduous forest with snow. Comms, water, the same. And then a shelter might be a combination of those things. You might find some leaves for insulation on the ground. You might need to dig in the tree wells under the snow to be able to find some of that insulation. Or there could be enough snow on the ground where you're looking at a snow cave kind of scenario. And then you might have the advantage of some vegetation like wood available for a fire. Your food situation is going to be the same. How about the desert? There's no snow on the ground at all, but you might be dealing with cold temperatures. So comms is going to be the same. Water, a little bit different here. So one thing I would add to my kit if I were in the desert is some tubing, whether it be a really thick straw or some kind of a plastic tubing that you can get water from a small spring, or you might be able to siphon water. This bottom picture here is that life straw I was talking about, where it's just a simple water filter and you can drink straight from the stream or from a small pool that has collected in the rock. And contrary to popular belief, you can't actually get water from a cactus, but getting creative on how to use the environment like vegetation as a water container to carry it from one place or store it just like you would use an Nalgene. So shelter, think about sun protection, wind protection, and insulation. Can you use the terrain? Is there rock like here in this middle picture? Is there a way that you can use the terrain to your advantage or build some kind of a wind barrier with rocks available that you can collect around? Maybe digging into the sand or into an embankment to help give you the most shelter possible. And then warmth, finding some materials available to build a fire, surrounding rocks to absorb that heat, and then the rocks will give heat out throughout the night, the coldest part of the night. If you can warm the rocks up, you can also use that to your advantage throughout the evening for better longevity in your warmth. What should you have where? So what items should be on your person versus in a storage compartment? And that might vary with your type of environment, your temperature, your specific mission. Definitely on your person, communication device, some sort of signaling device, warm layers like hat and gloves could be so simple, easy to put in a pocket, have it with you. I've even stuck hat and gloves inside the zipper of my pocket, zipper of my jacket. My pockets might not be big enough, but I can tuck it inside my layer, so I always have it with me. And then things you might want to have in reach, a simple backpack with your water, food, additional layers, your first aid kit, and things of that nature that are within arm's reach. And there's no right or wrong here. This is going to highly depend on your aircraft configuration. But what could go under seat is the outside of the seat going to be more accessible, but under seat might protect it if there's a post crash fire, or if there's something else going on in the cockpit that might impact the stuff that you're carrying. And if you have a wall between the front of your aircraft and the back, so if you're going to put stuff in the back, but there's, say, a firewall there or some sort of wall that's making the back of the aircraft inaccessible, that's no longer within arm's reach. Is there a storage compartment that you have to get out of the aircraft in order to access? What if that gets crushed and now your survival gear is inaccessible? So again, no right or wrong, just things to think about when you're placing your items. Obviously, there's a weight and balance consideration in there too. All things to consider and think about what's going to be best for where you're going to put your survival gear. Lastly, maintaining a positive attitude is probably the most important component of being able to walk out of a survival situation. And it's contagious. So you can choose to be the person in your group that influences the attitude of your whole crew and therefore your outcome. The positive attitude is absolutely key. So tying this up, knowledge is power. Your gear doesn't do any good if you don't know how to use it, or you've mismatched your stuff, like the canned food and the can opener example, or mismatched your gear rather, not your food. Plan ahead and prepare. Good pre-flight preparation, choosing the equipment that you're going to take and where to put it. Early communication, 100% key. Nobody's going to come get you if they don't know where you are or that something happened. Staying positive, maintain that positive attitude. And then this is a great resource for survival kits, kind of a good to go, like I don't have time or resources to build my own thing. I just want to order something and have it ready to go. I would recommend making sure, like, do a little bit of homework to be sure that this is going to match with your environment, your terrain, your aircraft, your skills. But these are really great pre-packaged, ready to go survival kits. So this link is pretty awesome. You can write it down, or maybe we can stick it in the chat. And these are great resources, so you can have that available and be able to buy something easy peasy. So that is the end of the mountain flying and backcountry survival presentation.